All right, and now for our faculty board interview series, we have Cory Duclos. Cory Duclos holds a Ph.D. in early modern Spanish literature from Vanderbilt University. He is currently the director of the Keck Center for Language Study at Colgate University and a senior lecturer in the linguistics program. Cory is a former managing editor and editor of Spanish and Portuguese Review. In addition to his work in literary studies, Cory has also focused his research on language program administration, classroom technology, and digital humanities. So thank you again for joining us for this interview series, Cory. We'll just hop right into the first of our 5 questions. The first question is in the perspective, so today we're talking about peer review, especially for academic journals, the Spanish and Portuguese Review Graduate Student Journal. And the first question is in the perspective of your own process when you are reviewing a paper. So just to start, what is your process for reviewing a scholarly paper or manuscript?
Great, thanks. First, thanks you for the opportunity to be here and to talk with you. It's always a pleasure to work with Spanish and Portuguese Review. My process is as soon as I get the request and the manuscript in, I make sure to put it on my calendar so I can get to that review first thing, and then I keep putting it off until the due date actually arrives. Then I do it all at once. Then that's not the best piece of advice, but that is usually what ends up happening. I'm the type of person that if you give me the due date, I can usually make that due date. If it was 2 weeks later, then somehow it magically needs to be 2 weeks later that I can do it. I don't know what it is. But when I do get to the piece, I like to read over it, and I like to spend a lot of time on that intro part. I really do think I read probably the first couple paragraphs a few times over to make sure that I really understood the point that the author wants to make, because I want to really take things on their terms and like what they're trying to say, so I understand really well what they're doing, and what contention they want to make, and they're presenting. As I read then the paragraphs, I'm taking notes, specifically trying to see like, is this squaring with what was set up in the intro, and do these things make sense together, or is there starting to veer into other territories, or is there other information, or did I understand maybe poorly the contention the person was trying to make? And so as I read, I take those notes and kind of like note down then the good and bad things. And then that way, when I get to the part where it's time to write some feedback, I can kind of refer back to those specific paragraphs. And I think for me also, the process of writing the feedback is also like, just like writing an article. As you write, you kind of learn things about what you mean as you write. When I write the feedback, I feel like that's the same thing. So I need to be going back and forth. It's kind of like a dialogue I'm having with my writing and then reading their writing, and kind of like making sure I'm kind of being able to explain it. I try to make sure that my notes are mostly focused on the content. I usually don't give feedback on stylistic issues or grammatical issues. I may mention like, there are some problems here you should work on, but I think that that's the author's job to kind of fix those things, and the editor's deal with that as well.
So a pretty deep look at content. And I liked what you said about kind of this dialogue back and forth with the material, your own notes, and maybe yourself too. I am curious about, do you do all of that in one setting, or do you kind of do it once, go away, come back to the paper? Like, how many passes would you say that you do in one?
Yeah, I think that I don't know that I ever have enough like concerted time without being interrupted that I can sit and dedicate all in one go. But I do like to have that time anyway to digest things and kind of like rethink over them. And even sometimes coming back and, a paper that's been kind of difficult to understand what's going on, or if I'm really getting the author's point, coming back to it fresh after a few minutes or after, a little while, and then rereading it again, I think that has given me that time to digest. So sometimes I do think being interrupted isn't always a bad thing. It might disrupt my flow, but also like gives me like a new perspective as I look at things. And I think that I do typically have a break between that time of finishing reading the article and writing the notes. So that's another way that I kind of break it up.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so thinking about this process that you're describing, this might not have a black and white, kind of like hard and fast answer, but do you have an idea of like an average time that you might spend with a full review process for one particular article?
Yeah, if you count the time that I spend thinking like I should get that review done, then that's like days. But the time that I'm actually sitting down, I think probably is maybe close to 2 to 3 hours for a more
Mhm.
complicated one. Can depend on how well, I've been asked to review some things where it's right in my wheelhouse. It's something that I know very well, and then those things
Yeah.
can go a lot easier. And then a lot of times it's other things that even if it's in my field of things that I do, it's a completely new perspective that I haven't ever considered. So that can take maybe a little bit more time. And then I've had reviewed things that are, completely new to me. So those ones are maybe take a little bit more practice, especially when I was as editor of the journal.
Mhm.
Uh, Seeing linguistics things that were in fields of linguistics that are not my strong suit, and wanting to reading through some of those to be able to give some feedback would take me a lot longer because I had to
Yeah.
figure out what they were talking about.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I also am thinking about too, not only a different content, and this might not be a question for everybody, but I'm a second language speaker of Spanish, and I know that when I read kind of complex articles in Spanish, even though I'm quite fluent, it still takes me a lot longer just because it's a second language. What would you say just about the process of if you're reviewing in another language that, yeah, second or third language, perhaps?
Yeah, I think as a second language speaker of Spanish and third language speaker of Portuguese, but definitely more of like a Portuñol type of thing. Um, I think sometimes there can be this doubt that creeps in, like, did I not understand it, or is the author not being clear? Right?
Yes.
That's the hard part to kind of balance there. And I think sometimes give yourself the benefit of that. If you don't understand, there's somebody else who probably doesn't understand. I think we often end up selling ourselves short on these things. I think that's for me the harder part. It does. I would say it still for me still takes a little bit longer to get into an article if it's
Mhm.
in Spanish, but definitely for Portuguese, those are ones that are really going to cost me a lot more time. So, um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, awesome. Well, thank you for sharing. The next perspective to ask about is you on an editorial board. Well, maybe not the different perspective, but the question is a little bit more specific to when you are making decisions about accept with revisions or do not accept. What are you sort of prioritizing or looking for? I did some of this was answered in the first question that we talked about when you mentioned about coherence between the introduction and what actually follows in the body. But would you add anything about what you're looking for or prioritizing when you're making these decisions?
yeah. I think definitely is the author adding something new to the field, right? Are they making a contribution? And mostly, especially is that author's voice there? I think that that's a
Mhm.
really important thing, right? Sometimes we get lost in trying to quote other people and cite other things that what you're trying to say doesn't really come out as much.
Yeah,
So not only do have you stated what you want to, has the article stated what it wants to say? Has the article proven that case, or at least, brought forth the evidence that would support that contention? And then has the author consulted the relevant scholarship? Sometimes you might have a really brilliant idea, but if you haven't looked at any of the scholarship, that idea may have already existed, or it might be there, or it might not be as fully fleshed out as it could be if you were to dialogue with others. I know that Stacy, who's the current editor of the journal, really has a great vision of a journal being part of this ongoing dialogue between scholars, right? And writing an article
yeah,
is part of moving a conversation forward. And so you can't really be part of that conversation if you haven't understood the conversation before. You can't just jump in and start talking without knowing what the conversation is. So I think that that's what I'm hoping to see when I read. Is there a dialogue here, and is that author's voice coming through clearly?
yeah, got it. So along the same lines of that, do you have any specific advice for one do and one don't, or a couple of do's or a couple of don'ts for
Yeah, I would
graduate students
say
submitting?
um, I would say the two do's I have are turn in a clean copy, you know, try to make the grammatical and the stylistic errors to the minimum that you can. And in that same vein, I think a good way to do that is if your university has a writing center, take your piece to the writing center. At least when I was in graduate school, the writing center had a graduate student staff that you could request to be with a graduate student, so you weren't with.
Yeah.
So it was a peer. It wasn't like you were just going with some undergraduate. Although maybe there's some brilliant undergraduates who would be good at this. They're likely going to be not in the field, and so they can't add anything to the content, but they really like I had really good experiences with people just helping me think through things with a completely fresh perspective. And while they couldn't add anything to the content in terms of the specifics of what I was talking about, they really had, you know, it was very often they had their own research, some similar thing that they had looked at, right? Or
Yeah.
some perspective in that that they could add as well. Or they were really good at pointing out, you know, this part doesn't make sense to me. And if it doesn't make sense to a, you know, a non-expert, an educated non-expert, it's probably going to be hard even for an expert to follow.
Yeah.
So I had a lot of success with that. So I would say definitely if you have a writing center that has a good staff, I would say take advantage of that.
Great.
I think I've already kind of said this, but don't lose your voice in citing others. Like as you are writing, know what you're saying and what your contribution is, and make sure that that voice comes out. If you see that you're citing somebody else multiple times, that's probably a sign that you're just paraphrasing what that person has said, and not really building upon it too much. So that's why I would say don't feel like you're citing something, and don't. I always think this is a good thing. You don't need to cite the book or whatever, you know, literature that you're reading, you know, verbatim lots of times. A lot of times you can cut that down or paraphrase it or refer to it. I think when we're talking about an academic article, you have to assume that the readers are somewhat versed in what you're presenting, unless it's some kind of an obscure work that does merit more lengthy citation. I think you can often refer down to it. But maybe that's because I work on Don Quixote, so everybody should have read it. If you haven't read it and you're reading the Don Quixote article, that's your problem.
Yeah, I understand. But thank you for sharing these really helpful pieces of advice. I wanted to ask maybe a follow-up question about the author voice. I think that's a really important point. Something I struggle with as a graduate student writing my papers is I want to show that I've read and that I know the sources, and also share my ideas, but not in a way that's like, you know, I'm this, I'm that, I think about this, finding a balance, I suppose, about, yes, I've read the research and I know versus where I can put my voice in, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think and that's one of the things I think is a big difference between turning in an article versus your seminar paper, right? Your seminar paper, that is kind of the requirement, is showing that you understood things
Oh yeah,
to a
that's a good
certain
point.
extent, right? So I think a lot of submissions at SPR are, you know, really well written seminar papers, but I don't think that those are often something that you would turn in as is. You would take that back, revise it, kind of
Yeah.
put in more, like flesh out some ideas more. And I think a lot of the things that I've seen, a lot of the comments I remember that I make when I review some of the pieces for SPR, especially are, you should do, this is the part that I hear your voice, flesh this part out, right? That's where you're adding something. Now build on that. So I think I think maybe that's again where you having somebody else read over it and kind of point out,
Yeah.
you know, where are the parts where you could expand and say more and go deeper, might be a good way to identify the contribution that you're making that somebody else hadn't thought of already.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And oh, sorry, go ahead.
No.
I was just thinking about what you said just a bit ago about the writing center and how graduate student colleagues that work in the writing center may not necessarily need or be able to add or support your content. But then I thought maybe in that context, that could be a really good thing because they're not needing to add more to your paper or
Mhm.
distracted with the content where they can just, like you said, have a fresh perspective. And in graduate seminars, I feel like some of my experience has been that the students, our grad colleagues, have been really supportive and often will share papers and help each other in that. But I hadn't really thought so much about what you said, which is such a good point about the audience and goal of a term paper versus like turning in a scholarly article. I think that's
Right.
really good to just point that out because the audience is different. The style is going to be a little different.
Yeah, and you don't want to make those changes. Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think sometimes having a non-expert can be really helpful. Sometimes as an expert, it's maybe harder to read something in like a fresh
Oh
light.
yeah.
I remember taking like a practice test for the GRE when I was getting it, and one of the practice readings was something about Borges, and I got all the questions wrong because I was like, well, I mean, if you know, it's between answers C and B. I mean, it's not quite that, but no, if you just
Yeah.
read it like a normal person, you'd be like, yeah, clearly that's the answer is B. But as like a graduate student who's like, trained to find nuance and everything, it was a little bit harder to answer that because it was Borges. So,
Oh, that's such a good point.
yeah. So having
Um,
that non-expert voice is never a bad thing.
okay. So to pivot a little bit, thank you, Corey. To pivot a little bit to the latter question, is in regards to professional development, when we're going through and doing peer review, we're doing a lot. And what do you think are some of the main benefits from the process of reviewing papers, specifically kind of geared in the sense of transferable skills or skills we're developing in
Mm.
regards to our professional development?
Yeah. I do think there's, benefit in being part of a community, part of that conversation, like we've kind of talked about.
Mhm.
And part of that conversation is being, involved in that back end thing. It's unfortunately, one of the many ways that academic labor is unpaid and underappreciated, but really necessary for us to move the scholarship along. For me, it's really helpful to see the way that people are able to create new knowledge and how they present that
Mm.
knowledge in different ways. I think I think a lot about the goals right now of my current university, which is a liberal arts school, and what is the goals of education and liberal arts education. We talk about that stuff all the time. One thing I keep coming back to is this idea that really the goal of education is in so many facets is to improve our communication. We do that through like reading data sets in scientific courses, or writing computer code, or analyzing paintings, or reading poetry. And there's so many different ways we try to become better at communicating. And so to see how other people communicate and how they're able to communicate increasingly complex ideas
Mhm.
is, I think, a benefit that our society needs, is more people who can do that. And so being able to see how people do that and watching them kind of wrestle through these problems is really good. And also it helps me see like new perspectives on things. My graduate advisor, Ed Friedman, always said that what we're doing in literary studies is constantly creating a frame that helps us understand a text in a certain way, and then only for someone to come along later and create a new frame that shatters the frame that we just built, right? And that's how we're constantly building these frames and then pushing them aside to
Yeah.
expand that frame and create new knowledge and create new ways of thinking and new ideas that help us understand the world in a better way. So seeing how other people are doing that, I think benefits me to see and make sure I know, like, oh, here's how we're gonna like push and expand our knowledge in different ways.
Yeah.
And so many times it's been often in things that, I still think back a lot about an article I reviewed for Hispania, which I think I recommended did not be accepted, but it still presented an idea that I kind of carried with me, even though it
Mhm.
wasn't, the article wasn't necessarily the best article. It still was somebody presented an idea, and it pointed me to some literature that was really interesting and really useful, and not something I've worked with, but still like something that's in the back of my mind when I do some of my own research as well. So there's value even in something that's not the most well written. Another lesson I learned from my graduate advisor was how often we need to look for what's good in an article. I think grad school is very good at like helping you, you get into a class, you're like, all right, we have a reading, let's find all the problems with this author's writing, right? And I remember coming to class once with that mindset in my first year of grad school in the Don Quixote course that my graduate advisor wrote, and giving like my firm, dismissal of this
critique?
author, my critique of all the
Yes.
problems, and him then saying like, well, what about like all these good things? Like, and it was like kind of eye-opening, like, oh, you can find good in so many different forms of scholarship. And so that's one of the benefits I see of being part of the review process, is seeing all the different ways people start to think about things, even if it's not the best scholarship always, it's still great ideas that people have.
Yeah, and I really like what you said too about, well, it stuck with me about even if the paper is not ready for publishing, that the ideas are still being communicated, and this idea has stuck with you for years,
Mhm.
and that kind of just circles back to what you said about just like how like improving and evolving communication, but also the necessity of communication to expand the knowledge and to share the knowledge
Mhm.
on a global level. I think that's really important. Um, and yeah, and yeah. Oh, and the good things. Thank you for saying that too. I think I often approach, because of training, things with the
Mhm.
critical eye. But what I'm thinking about in peer review, and I've only done a few of them, so I'm no expert, which is part of the interview to learn. But it does force you to think, I'm not going to be so negative and only say negative things to this human being who wrote this
Right.
paper. So I also will find positive. And I hope that the more peer review I do, I can also take that same mentality that you've described to when I'm reading, just for school or for work, without a peer review perspective too.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, if you have any other final comments or things that you want to share about peer review, or Spanish and Portuguese review, or anything as kind of a last parting word, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, the one thing I always I'm teaching right now again a composition as an advanced Spanish composition course, and
Mhm.
the front of my syllabus I have a quote from Don Quixote, which is the beginning of the prologue, where he excuses himself for all the errors that the reader will find in the work. And I always give that to them as a way of thinking, as if you're writing as a writer, you really do have to be able to kind of sort of divorce yourself. Now, Cervantes is always speaking tongue in cheek, and he's probably not really as ashamed of his work as he makes out to be. It's this false humility. But I think it's okay to say, I'm going to find the defects in my work. I'm going to be okay with other people finding the problems in there, and come to it with like you really do have to be willing to find the mistakes and accept those. It's a really hard, you put yourself in a vulnerable position. So I think on both ends, as the person putting it out there and the person who's reviewing it,
Yeah.
understanding that it is a vulnerable relationship. And if we can come to it with just thinking about, we're just trying to improve, helping somebody learn how to improve, or having somebody
Yeah.
taking that criticism in a good light, I think that's good. I think we're also trained right now, I think, through our use of social media, to read everything in like the most sarcastic and biting voice. And maybe if we can tone that down when you're reading comments, or if you're reading comments back from somebody, tone that down in your head and be like, maybe I'm going to give this person a little bit benefit of the doubt, and that they're coming to it with good intentions and in good faith. And that,
Yeah.
I think that's a good way to approach receiving that feedback on something you've written.
Wow, that's a really strong point to end our conversation with, because that is true about how we may assign tonalities to messages, written messages in our
Mhm.
head, that the writer of the message was not in that space at all.
That's right. And in fact, all of us who do literary studies make a living off of reading things into things that were not intended by the author. So,
There you go.
yeah.
All right. Awesome. Thank you so much for your time, Cory. I really appreciate you
Thank
sharing
you.
with our graduate student audience all of your insight and experience and expertise.
Thanks, everybody.